Okay, thank you very much. And my presentation is from the point of view of philosophy of law. It's a more general presentation, and I'm interested in the concept of autonomy, the traditional concept of autonomy as we see it in philosophy of law, related to the concept of autonomy in non-territorial autonomy. And I think as I should see what my problem is in the paper, it is what is the relation between the individualist concept of autonomy related to the collectivist concept of autonomy. Can you make a link between the traditional individualist philosophical concept of autonomy to a broader, maybe not broader, but to a collectivist concept of autonomy? So that's my theme of this presentation, and it's also in the paper. And this presentation is a continuity of the presentation I made at the training school in Flensburg last year. But I don't think many of you were present there. So unfortunately, you missed the first presentation. But in the first presentation, I talked about these principles that I have worked a lot on in my work on bioethics and biolaw. And these principles are the basic ethical principles for democracy, which are in our work that we did some years ago. We talked about what should be the basic ethical principles of protection of the European bioethics and biolaw, and what should be the principles of protection of the human person. And there we have autonomy, and then the idea was autonomy was somewhat limited. We had to accomplish autonomy with dignity, integrity, and vulnerability, and this should be seen in the framework of responsibility and solidarity. And I think in some sense there's a parallel movement with the concept of non-territorial autonomy. When we talk about non-territorial autonomy, we have also to talk about dignity, integrity, and vulnerability, and we even have to put them into the framework of responsibility and solidarity. But the problem with autonomy is there room for these other concepts when we develop or when we defend the concept of autonomy. And here, when we define it as political autonomy, this was what I talked about in Flensburg. We say that political autonomy exists when a group of persons or a territory are self-governing, thus not under control of a higher level of government. Complete autonomy consists of an independent state, but there are autonomous regions that have a degree of self-governance greater than the rest of the country. I think that's a traditional concept. So you have regions within a region, within a region, within a region. And then at the same time, you have the protection of individual autonomy. So you have this tension between individual autonomy and collectivist or collective autonomy. So the concept of autonomy, and then the question is, can we interpret autonomy as non-territorial autonomy? And there I think if we go back to political philosophy, at least as we defined it in this project, we talked about autonomy as a capacity of creation of ideas and goals for life, autonomy as a capacity of moral insight, self-legislation and privacy, autonomy as capacity of decision and action with lack of outer constraint, autonomy as capacity of political involvement and personal responsibility, autonomy as capacity of informed consent. And there the question is, does this apply to non-territorial autonomy? Can this concept cover, for example, culture, for example, rights of language, rights of minorities, and so on? And it's a general concept, but what is added when we talk about the concept of a group in non-territorial autonomy? That's my problem, so to say. Does this concept cover group group autonomy, or do we need to add something more? And what happens when we add something more to autonomy when we define it as group autonomy? If we look at the tradition of political philosophy, I think actually they have been rather critical of group autonomy in some sense. I think Immanuel Kant, he talks a lot of moral autonomy and self-legislation, but it's in many ways focused on the individual. But of course then the idea of the community of individuals as a community of ends, people who are respected with their dignity as end in themselves. But we are still talking about a community of individuals. Where is the group in this definition? And I think we can say something also when we look to John Stuart Mill. It's the idea of a community of individuals who are respected in their individual rights. And if we go to Jean-Paul Sartre, he has this idea that you have existential freedom. If you act as a group, then you need a collective goal, but you are such isolated individuals. So here we can say they have actually had a problem of conceiving autonomy as group autonomy. And what happens then when autonomy becomes the political concept? What happens with the political concept of autonomy? If we look at the developments after the Second World War, there has been this movement of political autonomy in societies around the world, the movement of decolonization. We have also in medical science and the whole idea of protection of individual responsibility in experiments. For example, if you have medical treatment and you do medical experiments, you have to respect the informed consent of the individual. But we actually have today, with the movement of intersectionality and so to say the criticism of all kinds of power structures from groups, you have a very strong criticism of the political power based on a strong concept of political autonomy. So that is what happens with the contemporary concept. And also we see, I think in philosophy of autonomy, we have a strong criticism. The first criticism could be the communitarian criticism. And I think, in fact, our project, this whole project about the non-territorial concept of autonomy, is somewhat linking to the communitarian critique of liberalism. But what I like is, in fact, that it is not called it's not called the communitarianism project. It's called non-territorial autonomy. So it's linked with the concept of autonomy without moving totally into the communitarianist position, as you see there by the book by Michael Sandel. But you can also have the second famous criticism was, of course, the feminist criticism. And I think the project can rely a lot on this. The feminist criticism is that the self is situated. It does not make sense to have a concept of autonomy of a free subject making his or her own decisions because every self is situated in a family, in a culture, in a history, and so on. But there's also some problem with this, I think, because what happens if we situate the individuals too much in the group? And we actually discussed this in the last session, where some people said minorities were not so interested in minorities' rights because they were interested in other things. But there's of course the third criticism was at the training school. Some person was very interested in this criticism, and that was the Marxist criticism. That and which actually is also the intersectionality criticism of the concept of autonomy, because it doesn't make sense because you are, so to say, embedded in a lot of power structures. So we cannot maintain this idea of autonomy because there's also an economic and political structure of power that determines autonomy. So that's some of the criticism, and of course the question is, can non-territorial autonomy respond to the criticism and still have a concept of autonomy? So following this philosophical clarification of the principle of autonomy, what conclusion can we do or propose in order to define the concept of non-territorial autonomy as an instrument for protecting minorities? There's this idea of extension of human rights to imply non-territorial autonomy moves somewhat beyond Kant and Mill, still while also following some of their ideas. Political philosophies of respect for individual autonomy and the rule of law in both geographical and non-territorial political community. I think what I would suggest, because I was very interested in this philosopher, Ronald Dworkin, who has developed this idea of the moral reading of the Constitution. So I think if we talk about autonomy as a basic ethical principle, we could say this suggests a definition of that non-territorial autonomy should be developed as an expression of political morality and integrity, and this indicates that the judicial system is open to the ethical dimensions. So you need in some way to integrate the idea of culture in a political system, so that you have this respect for political morality in a political system. And I think this would be the vision of respect for autonomy as a matter of principle. So, what does this mean for autonomy and non-territorial autonomy? We must apply the proposed concept of autonomy to the notion of non-territorial autonomy to really make autonomy work. So we follow the political philosophy traditional concept, open it up to the concept of non-territorial autonomy, but considering this, we argue that we should understand non-territorial autonomy as a proposed concept of autonomy as based on self-government in a pluralistic liberal society. So I want to balance between the two, the collective and the individual. There needs to be this place to be oneself within the protection of the group. I think that's the concern for the individual within non-territorial autonomy. So I will just say here, judgment is important. I think also if we talk about this idea of non-territorial autonomy, it's important to focus on legal judgment when we define the idea of principles and rights. So I should go to my conclusion. I think we are about 2 minutes left. So here you have my conclusion. And you see the book is also about biolaw, but it's a new book that addresses the question of legal principles more generally based on this idea. But if I go back to because it's those 4 principles of autonomy, dignity, integrity, and vulnerability. But to go back to the conclusion of the paper is to summarize a theory of non-territorial autonomy must include positive liberty and the active choices of the individual according to the principles of liberal democracy following Mill and Kant. So I want to maintain these 5 dimensions that I mentioned just before. The vision of ideas of goals for personal life, the capacity of moral insight and self-legislation, rational decision, political involvement. I want to maintain these 5 principles as dimension of autonomy when we talk about non-territorial autonomy. But then, of course, you can say, then I actually didn't account for the group. Then my problem is, what should be added when I want to protect the group? Or can I, from these 5 ideas, deduce the protection of the group? Or do I need to add, for example, number 6, autonomy of language, autonomy of culture? But will this be something that cannot be a part of the traditional concept of autonomy? So that's my problem in the paper, so to say. Okay, thank you.